Welcome. This is Hurricane Katrina, a look back at reporting and how the storm changed the media landscape in New Orleans and the Gulf South. This is a panel sponsored by the Electronic News Division of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Thank you for being here with us in virtual New Orleans. This is a topic near and dear to the city we were supposed to be in and to each of our panelists we're going to hear from today. Let me begin by introducing our speakers. I'll begin with Mark Schleifstein is the environmental reporter for the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, NOLA.com, and a member of its Louisiana Coastal Reporting Team. His stories on Hurricane Katrina were among the Times-Picayune stories honored with the 2006 Pulitzer Prizes for public service and breaking news reporting. He's the co-author of the 2006 book, Path of Destruction, The Devastation of New Orleans and the Coming Age of Superstorms. He's co-author of the award-winning 2002 series, Washing Away, which warned that New Orleans could be flooded by a hurricane storm surge. Norman Robinson has been a part of the journalistic landscape in New Orleans since 1976. In June of 2014, he began a well-deserved retirement after 38 years on television in the Crescent City. He spent 24 years anchoring the 6 and 10 o'clock newscasts on the NBC affiliate WDSU-TV. He also served as the moderator of WDSU's award-winning Hot Seat broadcast, which held politicians and policymakers accountable following the events of Hurricane Katrina. Travers Mackel anchors WDSU News at 4 and 5 Monday through Friday and now moderates the Hot Seat segment Sunday night at 10:30. A mainstay at WDSU since 2003, Travers has won multiple regional Emmy Awards. In 2016, he was named Louisiana's News Person of the Year by the Associated Press, and in 2014 was named Reporter of the Year in Louisiana by the same organization. Lindsey Maxwell is an associate professor in the School of Communication at the University of Southern Mississippi. She moved to the New Orleans area in 2000 and was a student at the University of Louisiana Lafayette in 2005 during Katrina. She began working at 105.1 KPEL in Lafayette in 2006 and was a journalist there for 2 years. Her undergraduate and master's degrees are from UL Lafayette, and her doctorate was completed at the University of Alabama. I'm Dylan McLemore. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Communication at the University of Central Arkansas. I was a broadcast journalism student at Mississippi College during Katrina. I was also doing news and traffic for WHJP 93.5 in Jackson, Mississippi. I was a huge weather nerd, so I was also known as their, quote, severe weather guy, a title I now realize we should have workshopped more so it looked more impressive on a resume. I covered the relocated New Orleans Saints training camp in Jackson in 2006 and 2007 as sports director for WMGO 1370 and as sports editor for the Mississippi Collegian. Like Lindsey, my doctorate is also in communication and information sciences from the University of Alabama. Let's start with Travers. Travers, you were there. How soon did local reporters know the reality of what had happened, and what sort of advantages did you have versus the parachute teams?
I kind of put us all under the same umbrella. I mean, yes, do national crews focus on the French Quarter and downtown, but I don't think our national media partners disregarded any of the other areas. I always tell people this. New Orleans did dodge a bullet with Katrina. What they didn't dodge was a horrific levee failure, which was probably the fault of the federal government, as we've all dissected in media here. If the levees don't fail, Katrina's a nasty storm that did some pretty good damage to New Orleans, but it's not Hurricane Katrina. It's not what it was. To answer your question, Dylan, probably a couple of hours after the levees broke, when water started coming up. I mean, I always tell people this, and it's hard to relate to people sometimes. This was 16 years ago. Twitter didn't exist. Facebook wasn't Facebook, Instagram, and we didn't have Zoom or cameras on our cell phones. So it was almost, if you will, boots on the ground type reporting. We were getting tips and calls that levees had broken and nobody knew where the water was coming from, but it was coming up as fast as it possibly could. And when some of this came in, I know Norman Robinson, obviously, who was not just a friend, but a mentor to me and so many other people in our newsroom. You didn't believe what you were hearing when you hear, it was probably a couple of hours to answer your question. I know I'm going to get long-winded, but it was a couple of hours afterwards, probably about 8 or 9 a.m. We had started to get reports. And like I said, we all now have the luxury of social media. Somebody tweets a photo from a scene. Somebody puts a piece of video up. That didn't exist back then. We had to go see it ourselves. And mind you, we couldn't get to a lot of these places because the levees broke. And when they broke, the water flooded the grand part of Gentilly, Lakeview, the lower Ninth Ward, St. Bernard Parish. So we couldn't get to a lot of these places. So to answer your question, probably a couple of hours after the storm blew through. And look, I'm gonna tell you, most people were reporting New Orleans dodged a bullet because most people thought New Orleans did dodge a bullet because after the storm blew through, Mississippi's Gulf Coast took the brunt of Hurricane Katrina. I always, not that I speak as much as Mark or Norman or some of the other great people on this panel to different groups, but I always tell them, if you want to see hurricane damage, you should go see August 2005 of Biloxi, Mississippi. That is what a Category 5 hurricane looks like when it wipes out a city. What happened to New Orleans was an epic levee failure that flooded the city, brought on by a hurricane and a bad hurricane. But if the levees don't break, I always tell people this, we wouldn't be on the panels like this because Katrina would have never been Katrina. So it was an interesting spot to be in. And I could probably talk a lot more, Dylan. I know we have a bunch of panelists who want to get to about a bunch of these other topics too. So I'll let other people jump in. But to answer your question, a few hours later, and that's when you realized this was going to be bad. And it was going to be something that we've never seen before. When I'll share a quick story. We hopped up on the interstate to go check out Gentilly. And we had to go the opposite way on I-10 from downtown because we couldn't even get to the right side of the interstate. We had to drive on the left side. And it was like, think Mad Max Road Warrior type stuff. Your cars were parked. They were stranded. People were on the interstate. And we finally got to the Franklin Avenue on-ramp and off-ramp right there. And you kind of look at it and say, wow, it almost doesn't look real what we're looking at here. I mean, the water was 10 feet high and it was covering an on-ramp where we couldn't even get off of. We had to go out on a boat with the police because they were launching boats off the off-ramp. So I think that's when it's set in for everybody. This is going to be something that we've never seen or covered before.
Norman, you were anchoring coverage from a station that I'd later worked for at WAPT in Jackson, Mississippi. So the WDSU newsroom was kind of split as you were trying to cover the storm. Can you talk about the logistics of that and how you're trying to make sure that the city's represented in coverage when you're 200 miles away? And also if maybe that might have helped with our understanding of what was happening on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, because you're now based at a newsroom in Mississippi.
Yeah, of course, the diaspora affected us in a way that we had to split our coverage by going to our sister station in Mississippi, WAPT in Jackson. That's because our antenna was located in St. Bernard Parish in Chalmette and had taken on about 25 to 30 feet of water. Interesting conversation we had prior to being separated, with part of us going to Mississippi and part of us remaining at WDSU, as the chief engineer at the time had proposed putting myself and my co-anchor Chris Fairbairn at the antenna down there, where we would do our coverage in the case of the worst case scenario. And I said that that's not a very good idea. And he said, well, it didn't falter during Hurricane Betsy. And I said, yeah, but we had Barry Islands in 1965 that prevented the storm surge from inundating parts of Chalmette and Lower St. Bernard Parish. And this is 2005, and those Barry Islands are no longer there. And I don't think that's a good idea for you to place Chris and I there. So it ended up with Chris and myself going to WAPT in Jackson, Mississippi, where we were able to see the brunt of the storm from the vantage point of New Orleans and Mississippi, with Mississippi getting the worst of it. We were on pins and needles trying to figure out while we were seeing what was happening in Mississippi, because we were in Mississippi. We were on pins and needles trying to figure out what was actually happening in New Orleans. We hadn't gotten any video in, except for that brief video of the station, which was high and dry at the time. And we were all jumping up and down thinking that we had, in fact, dodged a bullet. But that was before, as Travers mentioned, the levees broke. And to mention something else, I had a great friend who was embedded with the mayor at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. He shall remain nameless because he's working on a book right now, and I don't want to preempt that. But he said that they knew that the levees had failed, but they couldn't get the word out because all of the signals were down. There was no electricity. There was no way of getting any word to anybody. So they just sat there and waited for the disaster to come to them. They knew the water was coming. And when Travers talked about things being leaked out, I think that it came from the police and other officials who were in direct contact with the mayor and Homeland Security about the collapse of those levees. And it wasn't until I think this was, I guess, about midday in Jackson, Mississippi on the 29th. And it wasn't until that evening that we actually heard about the disaster that had been created because of the levee failure. And it wasn't until the next day that we actually got to see the footage of the widespread flooding, where 80% of the city was underwater. And my house at the time was in New Orleans East, which had been impacted by the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, the storm surges that came up that venue, and flooded most of New Orleans East and all of St. Bernard Parish. And I was subsequently a party to a suit against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Talked about stepping outside of my objectivity, my role as an objective reporter. But that was basically a all-Black neighborhood, and I was just, I was incensed because the Corps didn't do anything to protect the residents there. They didn't bother with any substantial levees that might be able to withstand a storm surge. And I thought it was just sheer neglect on their part. So I let the lawyers use my name as gravitas to give some credibility, because those people in the East were voiceless, in the sense that they didn't have any real stroke. And a lot of people bashed me for that. You're stepping outside of the traditional role as a journalist. And I thought, the hell with that. This is something that's impacting all of us, and we're all in this together. And I think that we have some responsibility to pitch in where we can. And that's what I felt my obligation was. I mean, I had a lot of widows in my neighborhood whose husbands had died and paid off their homes, and we were living in an area that didn't require flood insurance, and all those widows were coming to me as we were surveying the damage to my house, crying on my shoulder, wondering what they were going to do. And I said, well, hell yeah, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to sue the hell out of the Army Corps of Engineers to try to get some satisfaction and some justice. And I remember my general manager asking me, well, why didn't you let your wife sign it? I said, because I'm Norman Robinson and she's not. And he said, well, what do you want? I said, I want my community restored to the way it was pre-Katrina. That's exactly what I want. I don't necessarily want money to rebuild my house. I have insurance for that. But I want my neighborhood and my community restored. And I still miss my community. I just love that place. And I'm now displaced in another place, in another part of the city of New Orleans as a result of that. And I just think, as our first speaker laid out the foundation or the tone for this discussion, is that all of us are still experiencing this feeling of displacement. I mean, even talking about this now makes me sad, and I'm still angry about what happened and what I witnessed happen to all of my neighbors and my fellow New Orleanians who were impacted when this storm caused this surge to inundate 80% of the city, and we're still trying to get over that. So that's my assessment of what happened, and making it, the anxiety was exacerbated by the fact that we were, as you said, 200 miles away, witnessing this devastation from afar, having to deal with that. And the only contact I had was with my sources inside the mayor's office and with my colleagues at the station at WDSU.
How, Norman, you bring up a lot of things that I want to touch on here in our time. One of those is how a crisis affects journalists, not only in the moment, but in the weeks and months and years to come as it continues to unfold. We're still talking about displacement. So what sort of toll does that take on you? And we'll get to the economics of this later in the panel, but I'm just talking about emotional toll right now. And then also, do you feel like that's something that it should be reflected in your reporting, or is that something that you keep out of your reporting? I guess we'll let Mark lead off with this one since he hasn't spoken yet.
Unmute yourself, Mark.
Sorry about that. Can I share my screen? I've got some photos that'll help probably. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Here we go. That's Katrina the day before it hit. And you can see how huge it was. It was 450 miles across. I got a call at 4 p.m. on Saturday as we were looking at storm surge modeling that showed we were going to have a bed of storm with flooding of New Orleans East, Norman's neighborhood. And the phone rings and it's Max Mayfield to the Hurricane Center. And before I have a chance to say anything, he says, Mark, how high is your building? What kinds of winds can it withstand? And the publisher behind me said I turned white at that point. And I explained that, yeah, we were okay, 3-story building, and it was a concrete block and we weren't going anywhere. And why he was saying that is because it's coming right at you. And right now it's a category 5, and it's the worst one. It's the big one that we were always talking about. So that gives you an idea of what we were looking at as this thing was moving in. This is a copy of our paper on Sunday that nobody read because they were all leaving town, in a flooded news box that we picked up afterwards. And this is a photo of the lower Ninth Ward and, the flooding that was caused earlier of those flood walls. And you can see right there that were failures of the Army Corps of Engineers. What Norman didn't tell you was that he lost his suit because the Corps of Engineers was found to be immune from lawsuits by a 1928 law that was passed after the 27 flood, and also by the Tort Claims Act, which basically finds that federal agencies have lots of leeway in what they can do. And the leeway that they had was that they were able to not review whether or not their levies would work in the 40 years after in St. Bernard Parish. This is a picture that was taken at 9 o'clock in the morning by one of our photographers in the lower Ninth Ward. And we wrote a story that was online by about 10 saying people were in the lower Ninth Ward were stranded and people in St. Bernard Parish were on rooftops. The next morning, we had to leave the newspaper because our building was flooding, or we were concerned that it was going to flood. And we ended up basically disappearing from New Orleans as en masse, with half of us going to Homa, to the Homa Courier, which put us up and created a newsroom for us to work our magic with 3 days of online newspapers. And also LSU Manship School, where we were able to set up a newsroom for a period of time. Just to give you an idea of what flooding looked like for individuals, our staff, 40% of our staff was flooded out. This is my house in Lakeview, near the lake. The street is at 8 feet below sea level. Flood wall was 10 miles, well, 2 miles to the west, and had failed, a different flood wall from the lower Ninth Ward flood wall. Again, a different failure of the Army Corps of Engineers. The water in my house actually got this high. We have a game in New Orleans that you play. How high was the water during Katrina? And my wife always goes, oh, about 2 feet on the second floor. And that was me several weeks later trying to clean up. My wife told me I had to clean out the refrigerator. We did quite a bit of reporting immediately after the storm and in the months that followed about how to rebuild the levee system. And I'll stop there with my photos for a second. The issues that Norman was talking about, getting the information out to the public. I had a story out probably by 2 o'clock on our website that said that firemen had called in to City Hall to say that the flood wall on the 17th Street Canal in western New Orleans had failed and Lakeview was flooding. And our website was averaging 8 million hits a day for the month after Katrina. The problem was that nobody in the federal government was looking at it. And we found that out later when we looked at the FEMA director, Michael Brown's emails for that period. And the emails showed that the only things that they were being sent were stories from the national media, which weren't doing the reporting on the ground that we were. They were all at the Superdome or in the French Quarter. And so there was at one point an NPR reporter was talking during the time that Michael Chertoff was being interviewed by an NPR anchor and was saying, well, there's no real problem here. We've got people in the Superdome and they're safe. And the reporter was at the convention center where there were 100,000 people looking for water and food. And no one was taking any account of them because they didn't understand that the entire city was flooded and that there were people in places other than the Superdome. I'll stop there let you go on, Dylan.
Any of our other panelists regarding that, again, we're seeing pictures of your homes. We're hearing stories about things that happened to you individually, how you process that with your reporting and whether that becomes a part of the story, whether that's explicitly or you just feel like implicitly part of you is coming through in your storytelling.
Explicitly, Dylan. The first opportunity I got when I came back to New Orleans, I was reassigned to our home station at WDSU in New Orleans from WAPT in Jackson, Mississippi, after I had begged the general manager in corporate to let me go back. And so after 2 weeks, they finally let me go back. And the first thing I did was go to my house with a photographer, Drew McAllister, and we recorded and videotape of the disaster that had occurred in my house, which looked the same as Mark Schleifstein's house. We did an entire story. I think we spent the story must have been about 4 to 5 minutes long, where I went through each room downstairs and showed the devastation that had incurred as a result of the storm surge that roiled through our neighborhood. And I think that was the first time that people got a look at what the storm the storm surge had done to the communities in New Orleans, the 80% of the communities that were underwater at the time. So it was explicit. I mean, I didn't have permission to go in anybody else's house, but I could go in my own house and record what had happened there so that people across the country would know what happened. And I did it specifically because I'd run into people on my journey in Mississippi, and who were evacuated from New Orleans, and they wanted to know what was going on, what had happened, and what the situation looked like. So I went in my house to show them, what the situation looked like, and what had happened to our city as a whole. And I felt that was my responsibility as a journalist to do that. I mean, to shed some light on exactly what happened. And I use myself as an example.
My family, the house I grew up in as a kid, was 3 blocks away from the London Avenue Canal break. And for those of people who are watching this, and I hope a lot of people are and will, it was the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal, and it affected so many parts of New Orleans: white, black, rich, poor, old, young. I live right now where Mark lives. I live in Lakeview right now where Mark's house flooded, the same neighborhood. But it's, my brother went back with our mother. We weren't living at that house. She was still living there at the time. She got out, like a lot of people did not, but she got out. My brother went back. And I mean, I'll take this advice now. There's a woman, her name's Adrienne Rourke. She just got hired as a bigwig at CBS News. She was the assistant news director at a TV station that was helping us. And she goes, "You should come look at this story. It's pretty heavy what your brother did. He went back with your mom." And I watched it live on TV, which is probably not the best thing to do, because I may have shed a tear or two at the time watching my mom's house and the house that I grew up in, like Norman, completely flooded. Norman used a line back in 2005 when we did a documentary, 2006, a year later, that a house is a living, breathing thing. It's where you raise your kids. It's where your dreams are made of. And so to watch that and to go through that, it is difficult. And, not to go through all of what we all went through, I think the interesting part of this, and I try to, when I tell groups this, I try to tell people, I've never been a war correspondent, and my hat's off to everybody who's covered any type of foreign war, but it's probably the closest thing to that, because not only were we covering it, and I've had the chance for Hearst Television to go to Olympics. I've covered a lot of storms. I was covering Florence a couple of years ago in South Carolina, and I think our coverage was great. But I was getting back on a plane in a couple of days and flying back to my wife and my child, or my soon-to-be born child, in New Orleans. We were safe. I think the most interesting part of this is that the city, the state, and the federal government were not prepared for Hurricane Katrina in any way, shape, or form. Katrina has changed the landscape of disaster response, not just in this state, but in America. But I also think it reflected the coverage that everybody did, because we were all impacted. I mean, look, even if somebody lived uptown and you were high and dry, there was no power. There was nobody in your neighborhood. The city was completely shut down. So I think the things that changed the way that we cover this is it was a lot of first person. I know the story's not supposed to be about us or me or Mark or Norman or the other great journalists that were down there covering it. But at a certain point, you have to cover what's happening. And what was happening was Norman Robinson's house in New Orleans East and Mark Schleifstein's house in Lakeview and my mother's house in Gentilly went underwater. The professor who made a comment earlier from University of Illinois, as we were watching her videotaped speech, she asked a question. I can answer it every time for people. And I always tell people this. I don't like to be argumentative, and I don't like to be stuck in my ways. My objectivity went out the window as a journalist completely. And I am unapologetic about this. When we were on a police boat and when people are swimming up and they're going, "Give me your hand," I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm just a human trying to help people at that point. And I've gotten in arguments. People have argued with me over you should be objective and you should just document that. It's like, hey, look, you can tell me I'm wrong 1,000 times to the day I'm done. I'm dead and gone. But I will never, ever understand somebody saying, "Oh, you were on a police boat and these people are looking for help." It's like, of course, I was giving people bottled water in the days afterwards who looked like they were dying of thirst, just because it was like, we would do an interview with somebody. We're like, "You need food? You need water?" I mean, somebody may argue that that's not the right thing to do. I would argue the complete opposite. So to answer her question, my objectivity probably, I don't want to say went out the door, but went out the window probably 15 hours afterwards, when you realize this was a disaster like none of us have covered. And there's a human factor here. You got to help people when they need help.
I want to bring in Lindsey Maxwell, and we wanted you to be part of this because, Lindsey, you were a student broadcaster at the time. Now you're an educator of broadcast students. Can you take us back to what were you experiencing as someone trying to learn the trade and also at the same time cover this nearby in Lafayette?
Yeah, I'll start by saying 16 years later, this is deeply like a distressing conversation to me that we're having. And I'm like sitting in my office with my hands shaking. It's, you know, it doesn't go away. And so it was an odd situation for me. My family lives in, or they still live in Metairie. And that other professor that spoke earlier that said she'd been at Tulane for 5 days. Well, I'd been at UL Lafayette for 5 days. It was the very beginning of the school year. And my family evacuated to me. And so I had, you know, I was like 18, 19 years old. And I remember Travers, Norman, maybe it was one of you, my mom and my younger siblings left and they were coming to me and my dad decided he was going to stay in the city. And he said, somebody on the news said, take a Sharpie and write your social security number on your arm if you're going to stay. And that convinced him to leave. And so, you know, so my family and my entire roommate's family lived in our little college 2-bedroom apartment and their dogs for about 2 weeks. And I still had to go to class, and Dr. Davey is here, my college professor. I had to go to his class, you know, and sit there and talk about journalism. And my cousins and my aunts were trapped. My aunt was trapped in Memorial Medical Center for 10 days, I think. And my roommate's cousin was trapped in the convention center. And it was just like having to sit in class and talk about objectivity and writing and journalism. And I was like, it was the early days. It wasn't an iPhone, right? It was a flip phone. Like, I've got my flip phone sitting here. And if someone calls me right now, I'm getting up and I'm leaving and I'm driving to New Orleans and rescuing my cousin. You know what I mean? So it like deeply, deeply shaped the way that I think about reporting and journalism, because like from my very first days of learning it, it's about me, right? Like it's about my family and everyone that I know. And I think that's what it's hard for other people who didn't experience Katrina to grasp, is like, it didn't just happen to you. It happened to every single person, you know, in every direction for years. It happened and happened and happened and happened. So yeah, there is no question it shaped how I was a journalist, because I worked I worked in Lafayette for several years covering stories, and I'd be like writing, we'd get an AP Wire story and I'd be like, I know that person, or it was very odd. So it absolutely shaped me and continues to this day to shape how I talk about journalism to my students. And I'm in South Mississippi now. They're all very bitter that Biloxi doesn't get the same coverage as New Orleans over here. And so it's, it absolutely changed everything, especially for a journalism student.
I do wonder, and yeah, I'm having the same memories of like, I'm trying to do straight news reports and I'm doing like little 60-second drop-ins on the radio. So there's not really time for a whole lot there. I'm thinking about like when I'm not on air, I'm going back and forth to shelters and I'm trying to find people in South Mississippi and going down to Louisiana. And also you're talking about the flip phones. The flip phones weren't always working. Especially early on, you couldn't.
They were never. Yeah, no, not at all. And for my family that was still in the city, like one person could talk to me and then maybe her dad could talk to their cousin. So like it was kind of a relay game of like whose cell phone was working and who could it talk to, and which lines were down. So yeah, it was very, when Norman and Mark were talking about, they just didn't know. Like, I felt like I knew more than the news sometimes, because my cousin our phones always worked. I don't know how, but she would say, hey, I was that time between when the storm hit and when the levees broke, right? Like I talked to my cousin and she said, I walked, some people had brought their dogs to the hospital and I walked their dogs on Napoleon Avenue and then there was water coming up, right? Like water started coming up on our toes and we didn't know where it was coming from. So yeah, I mean, it felt the same way for those of us. I wasn't even a journalist. I was just a person. And I felt like, oh, this isn't on CNN. Like there's water. Someone just said there was water. So yeah.
I mean, I'll say this, and I know this is a journalism educational seminar. I know you all are college professors. I think the things that we learned, and I think the stories that we all continue to evolve and learn in the business and professions that we work in, you need to be prepared. But the number one thing you have to realize is that you have to keep your people safe. And I think Norman can probably back me up on this. We had a fantastic news director who is, for people that don't know, it's the top job at a station for across America, Anzio Williams, who now works for NBC News. And, I was 30 when Katrina hit, and I was probably a little bit too cavalier. I mean, I was in the Superdome, and I was like, oh, let's go. Don't worry, I'm going to be fine. But it was his job to make sure that we were going to be safe. And I probably didn't realize it then. I realize it now. And we learned lessons the hard way. We had a reporter who still works for us at WDSU, who's a great friend of mine and a great friend of Norman's, named Heath Allen. He went down to St. Bernard Parish because that's where he's from, and that's where he's always gone to cover storms. And Anzio did a great job of trying to make sure that we stayed together. We checked in. If anything got too dangerous, leave where we were stationed. I was at the Superdome. My brother, who was in sports, but probably was like me, was a little overzealous to cover something this big. He was in Jefferson Parish with the late Harry Lee. They were in a bomb shelter back there on Ames Boulevard for people who are familiar with that. But when the levees broke and St. Bernard Parish in the lower Ninth Ward went underwater, just what you all are saying, we had no phone service. We lost. There's great video. There was a documentary that was done called 7 Days That Changed New Orleans by MSNBC, and they aired it several times. We lost a $200,000 microwave truck because it went underwater. I'm not exaggerating. In probably 15 minutes, it went from water by the tires to water above the antenna, above the roof at least, touching the antenna. And so we knew that Heath was a smart guy and a good journalist, and he was with a great photographer named Tom Fitzgerald, who left the television business but still lives in New Orleans, who's a great guy. And I know as a news director that's got to weigh on you because you think your people are safe, but when you're getting all these reports about 15 feet of water and 18 feet of water that seem unbelievable, you want to make sure your crews are safe. So I think that I can't emphasize this enough. Now when we cover storms, and like I said, I've had the privilege, because I think it's a privilege to go cover all these storms for our parent company, for Hearst Television. I tell all these people, look, you have to make sure that your crews are safe and that they load up. I'll give you a 30-second version. I don't really talk, 30 seconds for me to go 3 minutes. But we went to go cover Florence. We were in South Carolina, one of the only times they ever evacuated Myrtle Beach. And we had these jump crews that came in. And I told them, I go, look, you need to go load up. You need to go buy 12 huge things of water, any kind of chips, cookies, anything. And they were like, why? I go, well, you're going to have to assume the power is going to go out. When you get your rental car at the airport, get 5 big gas cans and fill them up with gas. And it's just, you live and learn these kind of things. But I always go back to saying this. When Katrina hit, this country, this city, this state was not prepared for it. And we learned a hard lesson, not just as journalists, but from a federal government standpoint to a state government. Look, there were no buses on standbys. There were no water drops. I mean, nowadays, look at Gustav in 2008. They thought it was going to be the big one. They evacuated the city. May have not been the right thing. Maybe it was, but people got out. They got to higher ground. No lives were lost, which is the most important thing. We are better as a country after Katrina. I hate to say that because so many lives were lost and it was such a tragedy, but this country and this region learned that we don't want to deal with something like this again. We can't go through something like this again when a natural disaster hits. So you got to be prepared. But to come back to what I was saying, I think now if you tell your students anything, tell them, and this is hard sometimes because we all want to do the right things. You want people who want to be there in the fight, if you will. You want people who, like Norman said, you want people who want to volunteer to go to the front lines for the assignment, but you have to make sure that they stay safe because storms are nothing to mess with. And journalists bringing you the news nowadays, you'd hate to see anybody lose their life.
So let me talk about mental health for a moment as well, because that's a key piece of this thing, and it really came home to roost with us. You saw the truck leaving the paper. I was on that truck. We ended up in Baton Rouge. That first day, one of our employees had a nervous breakdown. And that became a significant problem. Several months later, her husband, one of our photographers, attempted suicide by cop as a result of what was happening with him for the same thing. He lived next to the canal that we're talking about.
17th Street? Oh, London Avenue.
No, London Avenue Canal. And his life was a mess. And luckily for him, it was New Orleans cops that were involved, and they knew who he was and did not kill him. So he's alive today and well, which is good. But it's something that's significant. We recognize that. We asked our management to do something about it immediately. Those first couple of days, the first thing they did was they went to their book. Who do we call? Well, here's the name of the company that we've hired to deal with mental health issues. And this guy comes in and starts having people doing jumping. And we went, no, wrong. That's not what we're talking about. And immediately told them, you need to talk to the Dart Center for Trauma and Journalism. And we ended up bringing in somebody from Dart Center to talk to us. And within a day or two, we actually had trauma experts from LSU Medical Center coming in to assist our employees with dealing with mental health issues. And it's a real thing, and you need to be prepared for it. Dart Center is there and is available for everybody, which is fortunately that we knew what to ask for them.
Yeah, as quietly as it's kept, Mark, I sought some mental health assistance for myself, because you never know what's going to really trigger you during this time. I mean, we're all anxious because we didn't know what was going to happen. We looked out in the Gulf of Mexico, as you showed us, Mark. That storm actually covered the entire body of the Gulf of Mexico, which was foreboding and intimidating in and of itself. So dealing with that, and then dealing with what it might do to human beings, was another thing. And during the course of our coverage, I learned that my granddaughter had been misplaced. Nobody could find her. Normally, my granddaughter would evacuate with me and my wife, but her maternal grandmother, my ex-wife, wanted my granddaughter with her at the time, and nobody could find them. And we kept hearing all of these stories about people who were drowned as a result of the storm surge, and people who were hurt and hospitalized and couldn't be found. And then there was the Red Cross, emergency number to find people who were missing. And I started calling that number every day and every night, and got no answer. Nobody heard of a person named Jenna Robinson. And at one point I started stuttering on the air. I couldn't help myself. And I almost lost my mind, worrying about how I was going to disseminate information to the general public at large, and then handle my own personal crises. And finally, after about a week and a half, I got word that my granddaughter and my ex-wife had evacuated to Picayune, Mississippi. Well, if you'll recall, that's where the eye went. The eye of Hurricane Katrina went straight across Picayune, Mississippi, and I'm pulling what little hair I got left in my head. I'm going like, why would you evacuate to Picayune, Mississippi? And so I finally found them, and after calling up all over Picayune, Mississippi, I finally found them. And then the general manager of my station allowed me to take one of the photographers and a car to drive from Jackson to Picayune to pick up my granddaughter. And we picked her up and then flew her out of Jackson to Houston, Texas, to where she stayed with my second oldest sister for about a year. So after that, I was really I couldn't deal with the frustration and the anxiety and the anger. So I had to seek out some mental help for myself. I had to go see a therapist and really talk about this, and talk about who I was mad at. I was mad at the mayor for not evacuating people on time. I was mad at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I was mad at FEMA. I was mad at President George Bush. I was mad at Michael Chertoff. I was mad at Brown, the empty suit that was that was in charge of Homeland Security. I mean, I was, in charge of FEMA. I was really, I was a roiling, walking madman looking to choke the first person that I thought was responsible that I could get my hands around. So, this mental health aspect is something that will impact you when it's this severe, when the crisis is this foreboding. So it's something to be considered and something not to be taken lightly, because we're not infallible. I mean, especially when we're dealing with something like a Hurricane Katrina.
And look, I always tell people this, not to jump back in, but I always tell people this. You're talking about journalists here who actually continue to cover the story, knowing, in most cases, like Mark or like Norman or the house where I lived wasn't, we lost power. And I joke, we got 2 feet of water. It came up to the bottom of the house. That was it, though. But the house where I grew up in, people knew their homes were destroyed. People knew everything was gone, but they still kept doing their jobs. And it's not just journalists. It's cops, firefighters, first responders, city leaders. So it's one of those things. I hope we never have to deal with it again. I think the closest thing to it is probably a California wildfire, when I see these stories about either a journalist or a firefighter or a cop who's covering a wildfire and they lost everything. But, we look back and we talk about it, and it's easier to talk about now. It's still hard, but it's easier to talk about 16 years later. About everybody knew that what they had was gone and that the world as they knew it was going to be changed, but they still kept on going to work and doing their jobs, because that's what I hope they love to do. And if they didn't love to do it, then you should get out and do something you do love doing, because life is too short. And I think we all learned that during Katrina.
Can I jump in and add a couple of things here? I think this is a really important topic. And I think in some ways, journalism has improved in terms of not having we're the tough people and we can't let our editors know how upset we are about things. But one of the things that was really different about Katrina's coverage was that a lot of the national reporters ended up staying in the area for long periods of time, like a couple of years in some cases. The New York Times rented a house in New Orleans and would rotate staff in and out so they wouldn't get too emotional about things. I talked to several reporters who had PTSD. I was kind of traumatized myself being in Baton Rouge, and actually my book started in the Manship School lobby with all of the Times-Picayune reporters coming in, and I was watching you all, and I never will forget that we had big monitors up, and I never will forget this one lady who was coming in and was watching the monitors, and she was just like, I'm never going back. I just can't, I'm never going back. And that was kind of the beginning, but it took me 2 years before I was really able to listen to 20 or 30 stories from people that reliving it, in different locations. And you're perfectly right about Mississippi. And everybody there was traumatized as well. And they'd talk to colleagues, but they didn't really want to talk to the professionals because that was going to take time away from them doing the reporting. And they wanted to do that. And I actually did have a CNN reporter who told me his editor pulled him out because he was just getting too emotional in his story.
Judith, thanks for your comment. I'm sorry, I got to grab the steering wheel here because I don't want to run out of time. I do want to get people from the audience to participate. I already see a few questions that are in the chat that I do want to give a chance. Paul Martin Lester and also Joseph Campbell's in here. Want to get to both of y'all for questions, but I do want, so there's one thing that Judith brought up that I would like Mark to address real quick before we get into those audience questions, and that is, after Katrina, population shrinks, people don't come back, ad revenue dries up, and doing this sort of journalism gets more difficult. Can you speak to that for just a moment, and then we'll do audience questions?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, it's a hell of a lot more complicated for what was the Times-Picayune and what is now the Times-Picayune. Part of it was that we basically showed Newhouse that an online newspaper could make money. because we did have 8 million viewers a day for a month after Katrina. And that led Newhouse to go in a different direction towards 24/7 online nationwide, which eventually ended up in them deciding that New Orleans would be dramatically reduced. They tried 3-day home delivery until the Advocate stepped in and went back to 5-day or 7-day delivery, sort of. But eventually they gave up on the city and decided that it wasn't worth their while to continue as an online operation in New Orleans when the community really wanted a print edition. And so they pulled out. The Advocate bought, the name and some of the property, and it hired, a handful of our reporters because it already had its own staff, many of whom were all Picayune reporters who had been laid off in the first couple of rounds of cuts. That's where we are now. I think we're actually in fairly good shape as the Advocate because we are expanding largely due to help from nonprofit funding from foundations, but also because we're that new thing where we're owned by a billionaire who is turning his head about profits at the moment and allowing us to continue, which is great. But that's not happening in other locations in Mississippi. I just was looking around because I'm trying to figure out where to go to find reporters for some positions we have. And I was looking at the staffs of all the newspapers in Mississippi, and there are no staffs. There's 1 or 2 reporters at most, and that's terrible. I mean, hell, the Jackson Clarion Ledger has 2 reporters. Come on, guys. That's a major newspaper. It should have been. And that, unfortunately, is, that I can't think of the proper word for it, but we're really seeing a wasteland for local journalism that's popping up. There aren't enough billionaires to go around.
Yeah, news deserts is the term. Bill has that in the chat. Yeah, that's the term that we use as we describe it. Dr. Campbell has a question for our panelists. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Joe Campbell from American University, and I think it's been a great panel. I'm really glad EJMC included it, even though we're not in New Orleans this year, and even though this is not a round number kind of anniversary that we're coming up on. But it's been really very interesting. I was wondering if any or perhaps all of the panelists would like to take up the question of the, I guess, the elephant in the storm, as it were. And that is the lessons learned from the exaggerated and over-the-top reporting that characterized a lot of the journalism in the aftermath of the immediate aftermath of Katrina's landfall. I'm thinking about all kinds of exaggerated, over-the-top reporting that we heard from the likes of CNN, which was talking about a nightmare of crime and human waste, rotten food, dead bodies everywhere. NPR was talking about attacks, sexual assaults, and knife and throats being slashed of 10-year-old girls. Maureen Dowd, in her column on the Sunday after Katrina hit, described New Orleans as a snake pit of anarchy, death, looting, raping, marauding thugs, suffering innocents, a shattered infrastructure, gutted police force, insufficient troop levels, and criminally negligent government planning. And international news organizations took this up too. The British press, for example, the Sunday Observer of London talked about New Orleans as having become a city subsumed beneath waves of violence, rape, and death. And partly this was due to local sourcing. The police commissioner at the time and the mayor at the time were putting out exaggerated death tolls. I think Nagin, the mayor, said it could be up around 10,000 people, and which would be astonishing. I mean, the death toll was astonishing as it was. Don't get me wrong, but 10,000 dead, it never reached that order of magnitude. So some of the problems with the reporting came from sources who would usually be in a position to know what they're talking about. But Nagin, the mayor, Compass, the police commissioner, really were throwing hyperbole on the fire or on the storm, I guess. So curious to know what your some of the panelists' thoughts about the exaggerated, over the top, and hyperbolic reporting and those lessons, what those lessons are. Thanks,
Joseph,
Dylan.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Joseph. I know both.
You can call me Joe.
Okay, Joe. Thank you very much for that question. I know both the police chief at the time, Eddie Compass, and the mayor at the time, Ray Nagin. As I said at the outset, in my opening statement, I have a close friend who was embedded with both of them at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. So they were very open to rumors, and they were not hesitant about disseminating those rumors, and it was something that took hold of the city, and they were repeating every bit of ugliness that came their way, and much of that I attribute to them and the people in their cabinets and their kitchen cabinets. And the national reporters were allowed closer access to them than we were, than the local reporters, because I guess we knew them better than the national guys, and we knew to take what they said with a grain of salt.
So there's two pieces to this. The other piece of this is the national response to the disaster, and the problem there was that you had a Democratic governor and a Republican president who were at odds immediately over who should be in charge and why. And the governor, Kathleen Blanco, who just died, correctly pointed out that because of posse comitatus, that she could not give authority over the National Guard to the federal government because they wouldn't be able to enforce the law. And the problem was that the response failed in part because the Homeland Security and FEMA completely dismissed a plan that the federal, state, and local governments had put together a month prior, and they spent a year on to who goes where, when do they come in, what gets done, all of it. And all of the emergency managers in Louisiana pulled that book off their shelves and started, flipping the pages, and it said, the buses will arrive at this time on this day, and they didn't, because the federal government had thrown it away because it had adopted a new national response plan and hadn't told the state that it was no longer taking this local plan into consideration. So that was going at the same time. The other problem was that, Russell Honore is a great guy, and he did a wonderful job of finally getting federal troops in 4 days after the fact. But it was 4 days after the fact, and there was nobody there. And the reason was because the National Guard was ready to go, but they were in New Orleans East and they got flooded out. And so they didn't have the ability of getting anywhere. And where were troops supposed to come from? Well, they were supposed to come from Fort Hood, from the cavalry, i.e. Helicopters, but Fort Hood had other things that they were doing overseas and nobody ever showed up. And so the governor said, okay, we're going to coordinate with other National Guards, and started bringing in things. And one of the things that you see are all those travel buses coming in on that fourth day to pick up people. Well, the governor actually got school buses in a day before that was really not covered at all, that started getting people out before the federal response started. So that's the other piece of that. All that crap that was, said about what was happening at the Superdome was a bunch of junk, and we tried to get the word out about that. The other problem was that you had some local parish presidents telling people that it was okay for them to go into stores and pick up food and water because it wasn't available. And that led to some of the allegations about looting. And so all this stuff gets mashed together, and you've got these national reporters who are covering it, and they don't understand what's going on because they're not really tied into what's happening.
And Travers, you were literally there in one of those locations.
Yeah, and look, I mean, and I'll say this. I mean, look, let's not kid ourselves. There was looting that happened. I mean, it happened. That's not an exaggeration. That's not a national media claim. We shot it. We captured it. We're at Lee Circle. We were watching our building across the street. For those of you familiar with New Orleans, there's an Exxon across the street, and there were guys breaking in with bats, and we were watching them going, God, I hope they don't come over here next, you know? So, I mean, it's not good. And it wasn't the most positive thing for New Orleans. And just what Mark said, there were people who were desperate, who were going in trying to get food and water. And there were other people. I mean, the day after, I was covering a pawn shop on Claiborne Avenue that people touched, and they were running out with flat screen TVs. I don't think they need a flat screen TV to stay alive. It was bad, and there was looting. So I don't know how much of an exaggeration that was. I think things got exaggerated. But to get back to Joe's question, this is, I know you're a professor, Joe, and I would ask you to frame it to your students like this. We are reporting something on the ground in real time with little information. Like I said, no Twitter, no Facebook. You basically had a cell phone. If the police chief or the mayor says we are expecting 10,000 dead, that's not sourcing from some John Doe on the street. That's the mayor of a major metropolitan city, the leader of this city, saying that. So if people think it's grossly exaggerated, it's not the media that's exaggerating that. The media is taking it. And look, I can use examples in real time right now, and I'm not trying to play politics. Donald Trump said he was going to build the wall. The media reported it. I don't know how much of the wall got built. Joe Biden said he was going to have 70% of this country vaccinated by July 4th. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't report it. So getting back to Katrina, and look, I think Norman's already talked about Eddie Compass and Ray Nagin, and we all know Ray Nagin is a convicted felon who, if not for COVID, would still be in prison right now. But having said that, it's not like people are getting this from quote unquote sources. This is TV recorded live interviews with the mayor and the police chief who was saying this. And I think what Mark said, I think the police chief misspoke several times, and it was not the most accurate information he was putting out. But nonetheless, he's putting it out in real time. So if things are going out in real time, it's tough to go back and say, one, we're not going to report it because it's the mayor saying it, or two, we do want to go fact check it and back check it, but you're doing it in a city that's flooded and abandoned. So, you know, I do think it's a little off base. When I hadn't heard about a lot of what you said, Joe, when the stuff you were reading, I had no clue what some of that was, but you can feel free. You can send to my email address or Twitter address. I'd love to look at it. And just like Mark, I'd probably call it garbage too, because I think a lot of the facts were coming out in real time and we're reporting stuff as it was happening in real time.
I want to get to Dr. Perot's question before we run out of time. Would you like to ask that?
Yeah, you can read it, but I'll ask because it's shortened version of it. So I wanted to ask you guys, and Travers just alluded to this over the last 2 years with COVID. Have you had experiences where you've noticed similar things? And have you had personal experiences as a journalist where you recalled images or feelings, or even if you PTSD that kind of flared up as a result of this crisis? Also, we're experiencing this crisis at an international level. So you know, that's different than a localized crisis like Katrina or a regionalized crisis, right? Even though all of us were to a certain degree affected, not like you guys were losing your homes. But if you could speak to that really quick.
Well, I'll let the journalists who are still working speak to that. I'm no longer working. I'm retired, so I don't have that issue.
I mean, I can answer. Look, I think I understand the question. I think it's apples and oranges. To me, nothing will ever be like Hurricane Katrina was, just because, you know, it's hard to put it in context. I mean, it's a city that's flooded. People couldn't come back to this city for weeks upon weeks. So yes, I do think you get anxiety with COVID. It's terrible. It's a worldwide pandemic. It's something that we're all putting the best foot forward to cover and try to stay safe from. By the way, I'm fully vaccinated if anybody asks. So hopefully we all are. But it's different with Katrina. To answer your question, something that brings up more anxiety for me, or maybe more PTSD, if you will, is when I see what happens when a storm wipes out a part of Florida, or what Maria did to Puerto Rico. That brings up raw memories, or what Harvey did to Houston, because I feel like I've been through it and I know what those people are going through. And it's hard. It's hard when your house floods, when you lose everything. So to answer you about COVID, I'll try to wrap it up here. It's all tragic. It's all awful. I think we try to cover it the best that we can, but I think nothing's ever going to be Katrina. Somebody mentioned really quickly Superstorm Sandy. And I hate to compare natural disasters, but I have friends who live in New York, and one of them's like, man, this is unbelievable. It's worse than Katrina. And I go, where are you right now? He goes, dude, I'm in my condo in Brooklyn. I go, well, it ain't Katrina then, my friend, because you would be out of New York. You would be evacuated for 2.5 months and everything would be underwater if this were Katrina. So Superstorm Sandy was awful, but I don't know. And I hope we never have another Katrina, but I'll let Mark answer as well too. But it's just other things bring up more raw emotion and more PTSD and anxiety than COVID, namely other natural disasters.
Yeah, so I'm at the end of my career as well, but still working for some odd reason. They won't fire me, and the reality is that the last year and a half has been very difficult. We're all working from home, attempting to do allegedly what we used to do with all sorts of resources, and we're having to do it in ways that are, it's like a slow, a very, very slow Katrina. And part of my frustration is the stories that I'm writing, I'm writing the same damn stories I was writing before Katrina about the Corps of Engineers. I got a story coming out tomorrow about a plan to elevate the new levee system on the cheap by the Corps of Engineers. And gee, they're going to add another 2 feet to the height, and that's going to keep us at the 100-year level, except they won't even say it's 100-year anymore because they're afraid of what the public will say when they realize that they're not going to be able to keep up with climate change or subsidence in this area, and that it's really not enough to deal with the next storm.
Lindsey, can I ask you? What's it been like for you after living it down there, and now you've experienced COVID not as a journalist but as a professor, and kind of seeing how our worlds got upended? I mean, is there any corollary there, or are these two still very separate, different things?
I mean, they're still very separate. Like, I think Travers kind of said what I needed to say there, but I get flashes of similarity in the scope, I guess. Like, the scope, I think, is the thing that makes it kind of similar, is that everyone kind of is experiencing it and having to go through it. Is how it felt during Katrina. Is, we people who lived there, felt like it's everyone, it's everyone and everything, and so that similarity I feel with COVID, but it does not feel nearly as urgent. So yeah, I feel flashes of similarity, but it's not the same.
And then finally, in our closing few minutes, Dr. Lester, you asked a question much earlier just about extending this reporting style beyond a disaster. Are you here anymore to speak to that briefly?
I'll give my usual diatribe, which is residual risk. The one thing that I have seen keep popping up, Katrina, BP oil spill, COVID, is residual risk. Trying to be ready to cover things that are going to turn bad and know that they're there before they happen is a real problem. We got half of the reason why Katrina was so bad right in 2002. We said that the levees were too low. We didn't know they were not built properly. We believe the Corps. We did not cover anything in the Gulf of Mexico involving drilling, and so we were completely off guard with BP. And we just basically ignored health stories and these new diseases for years. And so here comes one along, and it's completely changed our lives. And there are other things out there that are going to be doing the same thing, especially with climate change. There are so many things that we're not looking at right now that we'd better start paying attention to, that are signs of future stories.
We are right up against time. I did want to mention, though, we've kept talking about mental health, and we kind of arranged this on purpose. Our electronic news division started AJMC 21 with a pre-conference featuring the Dart Center, talking about those resources. So if you're an attendee, and everyone in this room is, you can watch the recording. If you missed the pre-conference, it'll be recorded. You can go back and check out those resources from the Dart Center. We'd encourage you to do that. Thank you so much to our panelists. I feel like I had so many more questions. I know you in the audience had so many more questions. Our time went by way too fast. I think you saw just from us, like I said, every single one of us were affected by this in some way. And I mean, today was kind of tough, but also I think it was just really valuable this was something that changed our lives. And it was a privilege to revisit with all of you. So thank you so much for giving your time on this Saturday. I really do appreciate it. And thank all of you for coming today. That's it. And I think that's the end of our conference. Norman? Yeah.
See you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for helping us.
Thank you.
Travers, Lindsey, Mark, thank you.
Thank you.
This is my daughter, Finley, by the way. She jumped in at the end right there.
Bye, Billy.
Girl.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming. Hope you had a great conference.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Great job, Dylan.
Great
Thank
job,
you.
Dylan. Wonderful
Great
job.
job, Dylan. Thank you.
Thank you.